Hello and welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Andrew O'Hare, executive editor of Salon, and I'm really excited about our guest today, an author you may not have heard of, about an event you may dimly remember, and I know how charismatic that sounds, but I honestly think that this book, which is called Shadowlands, Fear and Freedom at the Oregon Standoff by Anthony McCann, is one of the best political books of the year. And perhaps because of the fact that it is in many ways, many important ways, not exactly a political book. Anthony McCann joins us now from Palm Desert, California. Hello, Anthony.
Hello.
Hey,
thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining us. Would you agree with my characterization that Shadowlands is fundamentally not a book about politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's politics coursing through it, but I think I probably see it more as being about the powerful presence of history and certain forms of political theology and different kinds of sovereign geographies in the cultural impasses and also the political impasses of the present.
Well, there's an amazing sense of place in this book. I think, you're by profession, you're a poet and a writing teacher. And one of the things I found the most compelling about this book, and anybody that has spent time in the American West will feel that, is the tremendous evocation of the landscape. Many people may not completely remember what even the Oregon Standoff was, but let's start with where it happened. Southeastern Oregon, which is one, as you make the point, is one of the most remote areas of of North America.
Yeah, Harney County is, and there's one thing that local folks there like to point out. In the continental United States, they have the point that's the furthest from an interstate. The night sky there is insanely bright. The stars are. It's a huge county. It's the size of Massachusetts, but there's only 7,000 people in it. Something that played a really important role in what Ammon Bundy and his friends were able to do there. And it's largely a good portion of the county is high desert or sagebrush steppe with a big fault block mountain. It's the northernmost point of the Great Basin, and then the northern part of the county is dry pine forest. So it's a big landscape, not a lot of people, far from a lot of stuff.
Yeah, a big, pretty empty place. Now, what people may remember about what the event that is called the Oregon Standoff is that some guys who were somehow affiliated with the Bundys, with the now infamous Cliven Bundy, took over a national wildlife refuge in this county in southeastern Oregon, and that's partly correct, but really a tremendous oversimplification of the actual event. Talk us through a little bit what actually happened at the Oregon Standoff. What was it and what was it about?
Yeah, there's so much background.
I know.
There's so much, but Ammon Bundy, who's Cliven's son, was drawn to Harney County, where he's not from. He's not from Oregon. And most of the people who were involved in this standoff were not.
The large majority were not locals, right?
Nobody really in the group was from the immediate region. There's some people from further away in Oregon, not very many, and a lot of people from around the West, and some people from further afield. Ammon Bundy had become a charismatic, leading kind of inspirational figure within a pretty horizontal internet kind of community of people who call themselves sometimes the Patriot Movement, which kind of brought together a lot of different movements like sagebrush rebels, as they called them in the West. So anti-federal land people in the West, militia type people who particularly lately have been energized by what they call the fighting back against the war on rural America.
Yeah.
And then you also had, so some of those people too had been part of like the border militia stuff in the past. And then you also had sort of very Ron Paul inspired anti-police militarization activists, but from the right. And in that community, Ammon had become a very important figure because of a standoff at his family's ranch in Nevada when his family had decided that the federal government didn't have the right to own or manage land, and had discovered an interpretation, a very theo-legalistic interpretation of the Constitution in their very Latter-day Saint mode that proved to them that this was true. There are a couple clauses in the Constitution they quote endlessly, and basically responded to a crisis that they were facing in terms of new regulations on federal land, regarding the new priorities in the West. including for environmental conservation and species protection, in this case, the desert tortoise down in Clark County, Nevada, which were going to create hardship for them in terms of how they ran cows on federal land. And this all had to do with Las Vegas in the 90s. There's so much background to the story.
Yeah,
where basically Las Vegas was going to encounter a tremendous difficulty if it didn't figure out some way to keep building, right? Because it was growing tremendously then when the desert tortoise was listed as an endangered species. And a way was found to make sure that those investors didn't lose their money, and that was declaring this Mormon ranching zone a desert protection zone. And most of the ranchers there eventually accepted the new regime and accepted buyouts of their federal grazing permits. But one person did not, and that was Cliven Bundy. And he discovered that, the divine constitution was on his side, and he refused to accept any deals. And then 20 years later, after refusing to pay his grazing fees or recognize the federal government came to collect his cows, which had been grazing the whole time. And a standoff ensued because a video of Ammon Bundy being tased by BLM agents went out on the internet and went viral in that sphere where all those people had been interconnected through the internet, and they showed up, and a lot of them had guns. And in the standoff that ensued, the BLM decided that it was not worth it, and they backed down and gave Cliven back his cows. And nothing happened with that for 2 years until the late fall, early winter 2015, 2016, Ammon Bundy had since moved to Boise, Idaho, and he had begun following this case in Harney County, which was actually the only major city probably near Harney County is Boise.
It's Boise. About how far is it from Boise to Harney County?
Yeah, sorry.
About how far is it from Boise to Harney County, just so we can get the
That's like 3 hours. That's like 4 hours.
Okay.
Depending on what's going on with the passes and stuff and snow. So Ammon, people in his community have been following this story of the Hammonds, and the Hammonds had basically liked Cliven Bundy, particularly Dwight, the father in the family, and Stephen, the oldest son, or Stephen, the son who was working with the family ranch in Harney County, had been kind of fighting the same fight that the Bundy family had been fighting. Some ranchers, when regulations changed, adapted and began to work and used more ecological practices. The Bundys felt that this was they don't recognize the right of the government to even do that.
Yeah.
And from their faith, they think that preservation is ridiculous because the earth is here for human beings to use as they pass through on their earthly sojourn. The Hammonds had been involved aren't Latter-day Saints, but they've been involved in really resisting pretty strenuously any new regulation for a long time. And they'd gotten involved in a case where they were using fire on public land in a way that ranchers had traditionally, but was no longer allowed. And eventually they got charged with arson, and then they had been convicted. And also the way that the case came down, they also accepted some of the charges. And the charges themselves did have a mandatory sentence of 5 years, partly because they were written, the law does seem written towards instances of arson on public land near urban areas. So there's a sort of terrorism component. And the judge in that case ended up deciding to not apply the mandatory sentence, which resulted in the federal government appealing and winning and resentencing to the Hammonds to prison after they had already served time, which to the people in the Ammon Bundy world looked like, here's another example of the federal government defying the Constitution. This is double jeopardy. And Ammon, feeling what he characterized as holy urges, right, as being guided by the Holy Spirit to this case, went and began to try to figure out how to save this family from going back to prison. Right. And that culminated after a number of his efforts failed to convince the local sheriff to refuse to allow them to be taken into custody in the takeover of the refuge. And that's still the short version of that.
That is still the short version. But one of the things I wanted to pull out there that is one, I think, of the fascinating themes in your book is that although you and I can understand why technically that was not double jeopardy for the Hammonds to be recharged, this is one of the instances where you have to, if you look at it from the Hammonds or from the Bundys' point of view, it's like, yeah, this does seem like a pretty harsh exercise of state power. It really does. So it's like, to most of us, especially from the sort of urban liberal contingent, the Bundys and their fans and followers in the Patriot movement and all these associated constellations seem crazy, but the things that they are complaining about are sometimes legitimate, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that the way that they talk about them, and then depending on who you're talking to, there are people who are pretty articulate and pretty involved in thinking about things, especially with law enforcement in that movement. And there are people who are just pure conspiracy all the way. But certainly within that movement, there is a strong element of people. I mentioned the sort of Ron Paul anti-police militarization people. And there's a strong contingent in that movement, as I learned the more time I spent around them, who have been thinking about law enforcement and mandatory sentencing and prisons for a long time, but from the right, which I think people like us from the left aren't familiar with. We've been thinking about it more, along the Michelle Alexander line, right? So it was at a protest that's documented late in the book where all of these people were circling a private prison in the Nevada desert every day. And actually, a lot of their rhetoric sounded very familiar, right? But at that point, and they were very well informed on that stuff. And their characterization of the federal justice system as an incarceration machine led to their influence over someone who's seen as one of their leaders, Ammon, eventually while he was in prison, coming out with these public statements, basically calling for the abolition of prisons entirely. Not something that I think people who have a vague familiarity with him would expect to come out of his mouth at all.
Well, I think what you capture really brilliantly in this book is the tremendous, in what was a fairly small and arguably inconsequential event at the beginning of 2016, that first of all, there was a tremendous diversity of views. It wasn't all one thing that drew people there. That's one element of it. Another element is the power of the internet and viral video in organizing all these people, which is a really strikingly contemporary part of the puzzle. And then that in certain ways that nobody could have predicted at the time, but you kind of became aware of, this was an early indicator of how that historic year, 2016, was going to unfold, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the internet thing in particular, there's so much of the book for me that is also about the presence of, like, I think of it as like undead history in all our contortions of the moment. But there's an intersection of that with, our new privately owned public sphere of the internet, and also the way feeling is automated and the impasse is just continually accelerated, right? And so much content is just hurled back and forth, a lot of it with historical origins. But the role of the internet, both in terms of that effectively, right, in terms of emotion and political emotion, but also in terms of how it made the occupation possible, was something that was drawn to my attention early on by people in Harney County who had watched it happen to their county, who told me early on, like, you got to think about this in terms of Facebook. I remember a librarian at the Harney County Library just showing me her Facebook feed and being like, this is all about Facebook, and talking about the first town meeting where one of the first speakers was a local rancher who got up and just said, I think Facebook should be illegal. And that's all I have to say, or something. I don't know its exact quote, but said something to that effect, and sat back down. And as I began to think about it and then to watch all these videos and began to notice just how much the whole thing took place on different layers of the internet, it also became clear how much, and as I began to get to know the Bundyites, how they were a vast internet friend group, right, across the very alienated West, across communities that are pretty broken down economically with devastated public sectors, like this community of intense feeling and purpose. It's not an exaggeration to say messianic purpose, because Ammon is actually offering an opportunity to come forward. And I mean, the occupation, he was saying, like, come watch the wonderful thing, come be part of the wonderful thing the Lord is about to accomplish. And that includes basically like putting human time on the right track through its vehicle, the United States of America. But all of that he was able to do in this very horizontal, non-organized, instantaneous way because of the power of the Facebook Live video, the YouTube video, and also the way feeling is automated on the internet and brings people together. And it caused this thing that I think is one of the things I'm still trying to think, because I think it's really, this feels really important to think through as we move forward. The challenge to sovereignty that they were able to effectuate in that county, by virtue of this horizontal instantaneous network in this place that suffers from public sector disinvestment, economic hardship. It's a county with at the most 5 sheriff deputies up at a time that's the size of Massachusetts. The way they're able to just come in instantaneously, like a flash mob, as one journalist has described them, and challenge sovereignty seems to me to speak in sort of Ammon Bundy's Mormon messianic language, a type into shadow of the platforms themselves and how they seem to operate. And and the ways they engage with sovereignty on a global scale, with national sovereignty on a global scale, in terms of the kind of disruption they bring and have continued to bring, despite all the hand-wringing and public apologies. Just a few weeks ago, Facebook announced that they're starting their own global currency. A news story that was oddly, eclipsed by all the conflama that's happening continually on the same platforms of social media.
Yeah.
Starting their own global currency with basically a global bank that they'll be on the board of, along with people like Uber, and basically bypass. As they've openly talked about, that'll bypass Wall Street, which also means bypassing what sort of forms of, financial regulation are left in existence through the powers and sovereignty of nation states. And so much of our crisis right now seems to be a crisis in sovereignty and in our understanding of what a nation is and how that has been undermined. And certainly I see Trump partly as, the whole thing comes down to, in the end, people in an auditorium chanting, build a wall, and imagining this sovereign geography where they kind of, in an embodied way, become the wall. It seems like in the end, a sort of symbolic performance of the nation still existing as a sovereign power in a way it seems not to.
That's really, really an important set of ideas there. I think there's probably no possible way we can unpack all of that. But for you, because I feel like in writing this book, you're wrestling the whole time with the sense that this strange event in this remote place that involved at most like a couple of hundred people drawn together from sort of the right wing and libertarian fringes of the internet. What was the connection between that and the much larger phenomenon of the election of a president who largely depended on spreading memes and spreading videos and galvanizing the deplorables and the people who are on the fringes? And I don't know that there's an answer to this, but how do you think about the connection?
Very few people talked about Donald Trump to me during or after the election. Some people definitely support him in that world, but it's a point of contention in that world. There's a lot of people in that world despise him because, it's a very libertarian world. And the way the reactionary mode that Trump offers is super statist, right? It's super about like identifying yourself with law enforcement, with power, with ICE, right? And with the big leader. And for a lot of those people, there's a lot of open suspicion of that. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, watching again the latest horrors at the border, and then the way that spun out into another platform war on the social media platforms. Like, what's the difference? And I talk about this a lot in the book. What's the difference between the two sort of reactionary positions? Obviously, the much grander and more successful reactionary position that Trump has taken, and the strange sort of like retro neo-settler position that I was around in with all the Bundyite people. And I think some of it has to do with a lot of it has to do with the state, right? With their offer that Trump is offering, like, you get to be, it's classic authoritarianism, like, you get to be me and I am powerful, and our power will course back and forth, or, as you give me your power and I am engorged, so you shall be powerful, and we'll all be a wall together. But with the Bundyites, it's this total, like, again, staged for the internet, again, in this messianic way. It's a neo-Jacksonian, like, small government, going out into the frontier, even though there isn't a frontier anymore, and establishing like a maximum liberty frontier society. But that's not possible for anybody. So it's entirely in a world of political fantasy, which leads to one of the things that was the strangest about spending time with them. You'd think they're all these libertarians. And when I talked to them about, like, what was the most striking thing for you about being part of the occupation or about being part of this community? And they're always like, oh, the community. And then they start saying things, some of them would start saying things like, the best thing is we didn't use any money. This one guy even told me, like, oh, I was finally outside the war machine, which is not what you're expecting to hear from right-wing militants who've occupied a national wildlife refuge with the goal of returning all public land, to the people, and possibly to some of them to private ownership. So all that was going on in that. So there's a lot of division there. There's been division since then. Since Ammon broke with the sort of Trumpite agenda within his own world over immigration, since Ammon supports giving refuge to refugees from Central America, which earned him a lot of hatred in his community. But to go back to your question about thinking about it in terms of the election year, I think maybe more formally thinking about the role of the internet in mobilizing emotion and disruption, and also in presenting possibilities for different reactionary fantasies and community of feeling communities of feeling. Definitely that year was full of that, right? And full of also the unresolved history of the 19th century coming back to bite us. I mean, Trump, I see like the different, I think of the Trumpites and the Bundyites both descend, I say, from, you can see them descending from Andrew Jackson in a certain sense, except in some ways the Bundyites maintain a little bit more of that sort of frontier limited government fantasy, which has to be then reduced to political theater because you're not going to actually find a place to homestead anymore, right? Though performatively they were able to pretend they were doing it at Malheur, which led them, of course, into conflict with the local Paiute group, who had some strong critiques of that whole position. Whereas the Trump side has kind of abandoned all that, the small government part of Jacksonianism for the pure effective sort of, the racism.
Yeah.
The whiteness, and it wasn't a coincidence that Bannon. One of the first thing he did was put Jackson's portrait,
yes,
right, up in the White House and all that. But again, a long answer to your question.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, we should probably wrap in a minute here, but I really want to circle around to one thing that I think is really an important theme here. You write a fair amount in the book about the kind of tormented relationship between the occupiers at Malheur and local Native Americans, especially I guess that would be the Paiutes in this case, and that they actually made some semi-good faith effort to get Native Americans in that area on their side, which didn't work at all. But when I talk to people about your book, people here in New York or whatever who really only know about this event from the media, their assumption is that what we're talking about are wacko white supremacists of the militia variety. And although it wouldn't be fair to say that was completely absent, you make the point that it really doesn't boil down to that. It wasn't that simplistic, right?
Yeah, I think they definitely see themselves as, speaking for everyone in this universal way that, of course, the universal hero of their narrative still remains like a white man. Ammon likes to quote Martin Luther King seemingly whenever he can, partly probably to also compensate for certain horrible comments of his father's,
yes,
which are his father's comments are amazingly directly, they sound like they could come from a speech by like Andrew Johnson. Or Ronald Reagan, for that matter. But so there's certainly like white priority expressed throughout their thing, but they were not a white supremacist organization. They're not like alt-right in that way. They are this different thing and very Mormon, right? So I think when people were shocked to find out that Ammon was supporting refugees, I wasn't shocked at all. It's entirely predictable within his faith that he would feel that way. It's just surprising that he decided that he was willing to risk alienating a huge amount of people who supported him and come out and scold them in that way and basically call them warmongers and compare their rhetoric to that of Nazi Germany. But still within, the story, they're still advancing, like they were still very strongly advancing a white fantasy, right? They were, doing basically, I like to think of what they were doing out there was a neo-settler reenactment Wild West show performed, for the internet with all these messianic currents that they were going to redeem America and get us back to the proper future in all these ways. But of course, they ended up, like any land out there, they were doing it on what was native land. And because they were doing it on the land where the water pooled in that region, it's a desert marsh, which sounds like a paradox to people who are maybe familiar with those landscapes, which are very special landscapes, which is why it's a National Wildlife Refuge. It was an incredibly important space for the native people there. It was where winter camps were. So it's full of artifacts and remains, and the local tribe entered into the story very quickly when Ammon was announcing that we're going to return this to the rightful owners. They're like, well, hey, we're here, but we know you don't mean us, and they use that as an opportunity to tell their story, a story of like, displacement and refusal of that displacement and incredible persistence in returning to that place. Their perspective opened up, I think the nature of what that performance, if I think of it as a performance that the Bundyites were doing out there, and the racialized nature of that. But, very quickly, some of the Bundyites, particularly a man named Lavoy Finicum, who ended up being the one casualty of the occupation and has become the movement's martyr, and who grew up on the Navajo reservation, began to try to he made these videos directly addressing the Paiute and trying to use the artifacts as kind of a a way of beginning a conversation that didn't work at all because his understanding of what the value of the artifacts was is very different from the tribe's understanding that relates very much to their conceptions of geography and time and land. He's coming from his libertarian perspective, and as the local archaeologist there, a woman named Diane Tiemann, the tribal archaeologist, explained, the traditional worldview there is that those things belong back in the earth, right, where they're connected to the communities of dirt, which are these kind of temporal pathways that connect to everyone who's ever, touched that landscape in the past, a very different kind of geography. And so that clash to me was fascinating. Finicum's efforts were poignant, if ham-fisted, and probably also, in some ways, both genuine and I think also strategic, with the recognition that if the tribe joined them, it would have been a very different story. Right, in the media, if it was a bunch of cowboys and a bunch of natives out there standing against the federal government, you would have had something more like a Wounded Knee situation, which is a history there. That 1973 occupation is something that was very much on the minds of those of them who were informed about history at all.
Right, which is a mixed bag. I mean, I think what you do so well here is that you allow yourself to write a story that is very deeply embedded in history and geography, but you've really, for the most part, tried to resist any idea of heroes or villains. Like even in your analysis of someone like Ammon Bundy, you allow yourself to be a little bit seduced by him or to understand what is appealing about him without embracing his worldview. Was that sort of, did that just happen organically, or was that kind of what you wanted to do, taking on this story?
I think I definitely went out there. I mean, it was the tribe story that first drew me in,
right?
Because I was really interested in Native American messianic ideas, particularly from the deserts. And then suddenly the story happened with this very different kind of messianism of Ammons coming in. But I've always been really interested in Latter-day Saint thought and theology, and how the Latter-day Saint dispensation is this strange parallel dispensation to the nation, right? And to manifest destiny or what have you. And the political theology that Ammon embodies is fascinating to listen to, right? Because, I mean, these guys aren't like, it's important to realize that people like Ammon Bundy and Ryan Bundy are really smart. And they speak entirely, their education is entirely theological. So they speak in their whole political vocabulary is this political mysticism. So it becomes fascinating, and also becomes clear that they are really caught up in it. When they're talking about the Holy Spirit guiding them to what they're doing, that's what they're doing. And the presence of that throughout American history seems so important. And I think it's a thing that we on the more secular left don't understand enough. And don't understand the power of enough. And watching the effectiveness of it, and also the poetry of it and the weirdness of it, definitely drew me in. So it became not so hard to present sort of the spell that Ammon was casting over this landscape with his geography, with his Latter-day Saint geography, and then bring that into conflict with the other geographies that emerged from other protagonists in the book, including the Paiute.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I really love this book. I hope everybody will check it out. It's called Shadowlands, Fear and Freedom at the Oregon Standoff. The author is poet and writing teacher Anthony McCann, who came to us live from Southern California. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Thank you so much for the conversation and for having me on.